The farm looked like something the world had already given up on. That was the first honest thought Ward Callum had when he pulled his truck off the county road and sat for a long moment with the engine running, looking at what $12 worth of county taxes and 12 years of abandonment had done to what had once been a working piece of land in the hill country of rural Tennessee. The farmhouse stood at the center of it all, with the particular defeated posture of a structure that had been fighting the elements for decades and had simply run out of fight. Its paint had peeled back from the wood in long curling strips, exposing the gray bones beneath in the way skin peels from something that has been left too long in the sun. The porch sagged on the left side where a support post had rotted through at the base, and nobody had been there to replace it. The windows were intact, but filmed over with the specific opacity that accumulated grime produces over years, turning glass into something closer to stone. The barn stood to the right of the house and slightly behind it, and it had the look of something that had been leaning away from the prevailing wind for so long that the leaning had become structural, had become the only thing holding it upright, so that fixing the lean would probably require taking the whole thing down and starting again. Rusted fencing ran in irregular lines across the property, some sections still standing at angles that suggested they remembered their purpose. Other sections collapsed entirely into the dry grass that covered the ground in every direction. And at the far edge of the yard, half swallowed by the earth that had been slowly reclaiming it for years, sat the rusted hulk of a tractor that had not moved under its own power in longer than Ward had been paying attention to such things. He sat in the truck and looked at all of it for a while. Atlas was in the back seat, standing the way he always stood when they arrived somewhere new, body slightly tensed, head up, reading the air through the 2 inches of window Ward had left open for him. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, 5 years old, with the specific quality of focused attention that the breed produced and that years of working in difficult environments had concentrated into something almost visible, almost a physical presence in the cab of the truck. His coloring was the rich tawny brown of the breed, darker along his muzzle and ears, and he carried himself with the particular economy of movement of an animal that had been trained to conserve everything until it was needed. Ward and Atlas had served together in the final years of Ward's time with the Navy SEALs, not as handler and working dog exactly, though that was the formal relationship on paper. More as the way that two people who have been through enough together eventually relate, which was with the shorthand of shared experience that made most explanations unnecessary. Atlas had been trained to detect, to track, to alert, and to protect. And he had done all of those things in places that neither of them would describe to anyone who hadn't been there. When Ward's time was up, the paperwork to return Atlas to the service program had not gotten filed, and no one had followed up on it, and eventually Ward had stopped expecting them to. He turned off the engine. The silence that came in when the engine stopped was the kind of silence that only existed in genuinely rural places, a silence that was not empty but full of the small sounds of a living landscape, the wind through the grass, the distant call of something in the tree line at the back of the property, the creak of the barn's compromised structure making its small adjustments to whatever the wind was doing. After the places Ward had been in the years since his discharge after the apartment in Nashville that had furniture he had not chosen and walls that held no memories he wanted, and the particular urban noise that never fully stopped, this silence felt like something he had been moving toward without knowing he was moving toward it. He got out of the truck. The county road that ran past the property was 20 feet wide and traveled by perhaps 15 vehicles a day by Ward's estimate. He had driven it twice in the 2 weeks since he'd first seen the listing online, once to look at the property and once to drive the county assessor's office and sign the paperwork that made him the owner of 11 acres of central Tennessee for the price of $1. The assessor, a woman in her 50s with the practical demeanor of someone who had processed a great many transactions and had long since stopped editorializing about them, had looked at him over the top of her reading glasses when he pushed the single bill across the desk. "Someone has to take responsibility for it," she had said. "The county can't carry the liability indefinitely." He had nodded and taken the deed. There was a man at the end of the road, a neighbor with a place a quarter-mile to the east, who had driven past while Ward was doing his first walk-through of the property 2 weeks earlier, and had stopped his truck and rolled down the window and offered his assessment without being asked. "The old Pruitt place," the man had said. "Nobody's touched it since Edgar died back in 12." Ward had thanked him for the information, and the man had driven on, and that was the extent of the social welcome to his new property. He opened the back door of the truck, and Atlas came out in the smooth, economical way he moved, landing without sound, immediately scanning the property with the systematic attention of an animal conducting an assessment. Ward watched him for a moment, reading the dog the way he always read the dog, which was for information about the environment that his own senses might have missed. Alice was interested but not alarmed. That was the right way to read what the dog's body was doing, interested, curious, taking it in, but none of the specific physical signals that meant something required a different response. Ward took his duffel bag from the bed of the truck and walked toward the farmhouse. The porch boards held his weight, though they flexed more than he would have liked. The front door was unlocked, the lock having seized in the open position at some point in the 12 years since anyone had lived here, and he pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was dim, the filmed windows cutting the afternoon light to something gray and diffuse, and it smelled of closed space and age, and the specific combination of old wood and dust that accumulated in a place over decades. The furniture that remained was simple and sparse, a table with 2 chairs in the kitchen, a wooden rocker in the main room, a shelf on the wall beside the door, with a few objects on it that had been left when everything else of value had been cleared. The floor was hardwood, its finish worn through in the paths of a life's movement, and it creaked in the way of old floors that had been doing this for a long time and found it natural. Ward stood in the main room and looked at it. He had seen worse. He had slept in places that made this farmhouse look like the Ritz, and he had done it without complaint because complaining used energy that was needed elsewhere. What he was looking at was a structure that had good bones beneath its neglect, that had been built by someone who understood what lasted and had built accordingly. The walls were plumb. The ceiling was intact except for one section in the corner where water had worked through over the years and left its stain. The floor was sound. It was fixable. That was the point. He set his duffel bag on the kitchen table, and Atlas came in and moved through the rooms with his nose working, reading everything that a dog's nose could read in a place that had been closed for 12 years, which was a great deal more than Ward could read with his. Ward found the bedroom at the back of the house, a metal frame bed with a mattress that would need to be replaced, a dresser, a window that looked out on the barn and the tree line beyond. He crouched beside the bed and checked under it out of habit, the habit of checking confined spaces in new environments, and under the bed pushed to the far corner where it would not have been visible to anyone who hadn't crouched down to look, was a book, not a commercial book, a journal, cloth bound its cover, dark with age and the oils of the hands that had handled it. He reached under and pulled it out and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the cover. There was nothing on the cover. He opened it. The handwriting inside was the handwriting of an older man, the letters formed with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to write in an era when handwriting was taught as a skill worth mastering, slightly angular, consistent, the work of a specific hand across many years. He turned to the first page and read. The journal began with a date, September 12, 1952. The first entry was brief, took possession today, 11 acres, the house, the barn, the north field. Paid cash, took me 8 years to save it, but it's mine now. Nobody can touch it. Ward turned the page. The second entry was longer, It described the work of the first weeks on the property, the repairs made to the barn roof, the clearing of the north field, the planting of a kitchen garden on the south side of the house. The writing was practical and detailed, the record of a man who tracked his work the way someone tracked a project, noting what had been done and what remained. He turned further into the journal, letting the pages open where they wanted to open reading fragments. He found a page that had been written in a different register than the practical entries around it, a page that felt different the moment he encountered it. The handwriting slightly more deliberate, as though the writer had been taking care with these particular words. "I've thought about this for a long time," the entry read, "about what to do with the things I have gathered. I have no family to give it to. I have no one I trust enough to tell. What I have accumulated over these years, it was never for me. I always knew that. I built this because of the men I saw come home from the war and have nothing to stand on. I had nothing either, but I was stubborn enough to build something from nothing. And not everyone has that in them. And that's not a failure of character. It's just the truth of what the war took from some men that it didn't take from others." Ward stopped reading. He sat on the edge of the bed in the failing afternoon light and held the journal and looked at the window and the view of the barn through it, the leaning barn with its decades of weathering. And he thought about the sentence he had just read. "I built this because of the men I saw come home from the war and have nothing." He read it again. Then he read the sentence that followed it. "I am building something for whoever comes after. I don't know who that will be. But if they find it, I want them to have what I never could give the men I watched struggle." The final line of that entry stood apart from the rest, written slightly larger, as though the writer had wanted to be sure it was not missed. "I built this not for myself. I built it for whoever would come after. If you are reading this, that is you." Ward closed the journal. He sat with it in his hands for a moment. Then he set it on the dresser beside the window and went to find Atlas, who had finished his interior assessment and was standing at the back door looking out at the property with the calm attention of a dog that had decided the immediate environment was acceptable and was now simply observing what it offered. Ward opened the back door and they went out together into the late afternoon. The weeks that followed were the work of establishment. Ward was not a man who required comfort to function, but he was a man who required functionality, and the farmhouse in its current state required attention before it could provide even the basics. He started with the roof, finding and addressing the section above the bedroom corner where water had been getting through. He replaced the rotted support post on the porch and reset the porch boards that had gone soft. He got the electricity working properly, tracing the fault in the panel to a breaker that had failed and replacing it. He got the plumbing functional, which required an afternoon under the house in the crawl space that he did not think about any more than necessary. Money was the constraint. His military savings were not large, the product of a life lived in circumstances that did not offer many opportunities to spend money, but also did not produce the kind of income that accumulated meaningfully over time. He worked carefully prioritizing what was essential over what was merely desirable buying materials at the hardware store in town in the specific quantities needed for each job, rather than in the larger amounts that would have been more efficient but cost more upfront. The hardware store was run by a man named Grover, who was in his 60s and had the unhurried manner of someone who had been in the same place for long enough that he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Grover had watched Ward make several trips for materials before he said anything beyond the necessary transactional exchanges. And then one morning when Ward came in for lumber, he had looked at him over the counter and asked how the Pruitt place was coming along. "Nobody's touched that property since Edgar passed," Grover said. 12 years it sat there. He paused, adding up the lumber Ward had indicated. You know anything about him? About Edgar Pruitt? Not much, Ward said. Grover nodded. Quiet man, he said. Very quiet. Kept to himself for as long as I can remember, and I grew up here. He'd come in for supplies, pay cash, go home. Didn't talk much. He paused again. People used to wonder about him, all those years alone out there. He finished adding the numbers and told Ward the total. Ward paid and loaded the lumber into the truck and drove back to the farm. That evening, after the day's work was done and Atlas had eaten, and Ward was sitting on the repaired porch watching the light go out of the sky over the tree line to the west, he thought about what Grover had said. Quiet man, kept to himself, all those years alone. He thought about the journal and the entry he had read on the first day and the sentence that had stayed with him through the weeks of work. I built this not for myself. I built it for whoever would come after. He went inside and retrieved the journal from the dresser and brought it back to the porch and read it properly for the first time from the beginning in sequence, letting the entries build the picture they were trying to build. Edgar Pruitt had come home from the war in the autumn of 1945. He had been 22 years old. The journal did not describe the war directly, did not narrate what had happened in specific places on specific days, the way some veterans' accounts did. What it described instead were the men he had served with, the men he had come home alongside and then watched over the years that followed struggle with the return in ways he had not fully anticipated. I see Alvin at the hardware store. Sometimes one entry read, "He is 40 now and looks 60. His hands shake when he picks things up. He drinks. There is no work for him that his body can manage after what happened to it, and there is no support from any source that amounts to what he needs. We came home and the country moved on, and men like Alvin were simply the residue of a thing that was over." Ward read that paragraph twice. The journal moved forward through the years. Edgar had worked a series of jobs in the years after the war, the physical labor of a man who was strong and who had no particular credentials other than his strength and his reliability. He had saved with the systematic discipline of someone who understood that what he was saving toward was not a comfort but a purpose. When he had saved enough, he had bought the property and begun what he described in the careful, practical language of all his entries as the project. The project was not named in the early entries. It was simply referred to as the project, the way you referred to something whose full name would require a conversation you were not ready to have on the page. Ward read through years of entries that tracked the project's progress without fully describing what the project was noting: materials acquired and work completed and the passage of seasons on the property. And gradually the shape of what Edgar had been doing became visible not through direct description, but through the accumulation of detail. He was building something underground. The entries referenced excavation, referenced the acquisition of specific types of steel, referenced the particular challenges of maintaining something sealed against moisture in Tennessee's climate, which was not the climate of easy preservation. Edgar had clearly thought deeply about the engineering of what he was building and had solved its problems over years with the patience of someone who was not in a hurry, because the purpose of the thing was larger than any particular timeline. The later entries became more philosophical. Edgar had been in his 70s and 80s when the final sections of the journal were written, the handwriting slightly more effortful, the sentences slightly shorter, but no less precise in their meaning. "I am 78 now," one entry read. "The project is complete as it will be. I have added what I can add. What I have built it is not about the money. I want whoever finds it to understand that. The money is a tool. It is a foundation. What matters is what it enables someone to do with their life who might not otherwise have the means to do it." Ward was sitting on the porch in full dark by the time he reached the final entries. He had turned on the single exterior light above the door, and it cast a yellow circle on the boards around him and left the rest of the property in the dark. Atlas was lying beside the chair, his chin on his paws, his eyes open, watching the dark field in the way he always watched things. The final entry was dated October 3rd, 2009. 3 years before Edgar had died. The handwriting was still careful, but it had the quality of late handwriting, slightly more deliberate, each letter placed with attention. I have put everything I need to put in the document, the entry read. The document is where whoever finds the project will know it is theirs to use. I hope they use it the way I intend. I hope whoever they are, they have the kind of patience that this land requires. The land will tell you what it needs if you listen to it. And underneath the land, I have put what I hope will give someone the chance that Alvin never had. The final line of the journal was separate from the paragraph above it, centered on the page, as though Edgar had wanted it to stand alone. To whoever comes after this was always yours. I just kept it until you arrived. Ward closed the journal. He sat in the yellow circle of the porch light, with the journal in his hands, and Atlas beside him, and the Tennessee dark around him, and he thought about a man who had spent 60 years building something in secret for someone he would never meet because of what he had watched happen to the men he had served beside, because of the particular silence that had descended over those men when the country had moved on and left them behind. He understood that silence. He had been living in it for 2 years. He set the journal on his knee and looked out at the dark field and the dark barn and the dark tree line and the stars above all of it. And he thought about the phrase Edgar had used, the project. And then he thought about the entry he had read on the very first day. I built this not for myself. I built it for whoever would come after. If you are reading this, that is you. He had been here for 3 weeks. The barn had 1 repaired wall and 3 that still needed attention. The kitchen garden was in and growing. The north field was half cleared of the brush that had taken it over in 12 years of neglect. The porch was level again, and the roof held water out, and the electricity worked, and the plumbing worked, and the place was starting slowly and with the particular resistance of something long dormant to become functional again. He had not thought much about the journal in the weeks of work. He had read the first page and set it aside and worked because working was what he knew how to do, and the farm needed work, and that was enough to fill the days. But sitting on the porch in the dark, with the complete journal in his hands, the picture it contained fully assembled, he found himself thinking about the phrase, the project, with a different quality of attention than he had given it before. He looked at Atlas. Atlas lifted his head and met his eyes with the particular directness of the breed, the look of a dog that was fully present with the person looking at it. Ward had noted in the weeks since their arrival that Atlas had developed an interest in a specific location on the property. Not a dramatic or alarming interest, a quiet, persistent returning to interest the way the dog returned to things that had registered for him and that he was still processing. The location was the far corner of the barn's interior where the ground dipped very slightly, where the temperature Ward had noticed when working in the barn seemed slightly lower than the surrounding floor even on warm days. He had assumed it was a function of air circulation in the barn structure, some specific geometry of the building that directed cooler air toward that corner. It was a reasonable explanation, and he had not thought about it further. He thought about it now. He thought about 60 years of project, about steel and excavation and moisture management, about a man who had been a carpenter and a farmer and who had spent decades solving engineering problems in secret on 11 acres of Tennessee Hill country, about the temperature differential in the corner of the barn that Atlas kept returning to. He put the journal on the porch railing and stood up. He went inside and got his flashlight from the kitchen counter where he kept it, the heavy 5-cell light that threw a beam you could see a long way with, and he came back out and stepped off the porch into the grass. Atlas was already up and moving beside him, reading the direction they were walking, reading the quality of purpose in his movement, already oriented toward the barn. The barn door opened with the groan of long, unlubricated hinges, and Ward stepped inside and directed the flashlight beam across the floor to the far corner. The ground there was packed dirt, undisturbed, looking exactly like the rest of the barn floor. Nothing visible, nothing that would tell you anything. Atlas crossed the barn floor ahead of him and went to the corner and stood over it and looked back at Ward. Not a bark, not the urgent claw and dig of an excited dog. The still directed, sustained attention of a trained animal indicating something specific. Ward crouched down and put his hand on the floor in the corner. The earth was cold. Noticeably, specifically cold in the way of ground that had something beneath it that altered the temperature of the surface above it. He stood up and went back to the house and got the shovel from the tool shed and came back to the barn. He began to dig. The soil came up easily in the first several inches, the loose top layer of years of accumulated organic material and the ordinary disturbance of earth near a structure. Then the shovel found something different, not rock, not the compressed clay subsoil that underlay most of the property. Something that gave a different sound when the metal struck it. Flat, dense, resonant with the particular hollow note of metal over an interior space. Ward went to one knee and brushed the soil away with his hands. The surface beneath was steel. He cleared a wider area, working methodically outward from the center of what he had found, and the shape that emerged from the soil was unmistakable, a hatch, large, heavy, its steel surface dark with oxidation, but structurally intact, set into the floor of the barn with the precision of deliberate engineering. It had a handle, thick and solid, centered on the hatch, and it had a lock, an iron padlock the size of Ward's fist, rusted with age, but engaged the shackle seated fully in the body of the lock. Ward sat back on his heels and looked at it. Atlas stood beside him, absolutely still, his nose working. Ward thought about the journal on the porch railing, about 60 years of a project, about the final line of the final entry. To whoever comes after this was always yours. I just kept it until you arrived. He stood up and went back to the house for the tools he would need. The lock took Ward 2 hours to defeat, not because he lacked the skill or the tools, but because he refused to rush it. A lock that had been sitting in Tennessee humidity for 12 years, possibly longer, with an iron mechanism that had been oxidizing since the day it was set, required patience more than force. Force applied incorrectly to corroded metal produced broken metal, and broken metal could mean a damaged hatch, a damaged frame, a damaged mechanism that made accessing what lay beneath it more difficult or impossible. Ward had learned this principle in environments where getting a door open was sometimes the difference between outcomes, and he applied it now with the same care he would have applied it anywhere. He worked with penetrating oil, first applying it to the shackle and the keyway and every joint of the lock mechanism he could access, and then he waited, and then he worked it again, rocking the lock gently, feeling for the give of lubricant, working into the corrosion. And then he waited again. Atlas lay in the barn doorway behind him, watching his chin on his paws, his eyes tracking Ward's movements with the patient attention of an animal that understood that some work took the time it took. When the lock finally yielded, it did so with a sound like something exhaling the long-held tension of seized metal, releasing all at once. And Ward held the open lock in his hand for a moment and looked at it. Then he set it on the barn floor beside him and took hold of the hatch handle with both hands and pulled. The hatch was heavy, heavier than it looked, the steel thick enough to insulate what lay beneath it, and strong enough to bear whatever had been placed on top of it over the years. It rose with a groan of long unused hinges, slowly at first, and then faster as the angle changed, and the physics of it began to assist. And when it was fully open, it settled back against a stop that Edgar had built into the frame for exactly this purpose, holding itself open without assistance. Cold air came up from below, not the damp cold of a flooded space. Clean cold, the cold of earth temperature air that had been sealed from the surface for years, carrying with it the smell of concrete and something dry and slightly metallic, and the specific quality of a sealed environment, not unpleasant, just sealed the way a room smells when it has been closed for a very long time. Ward directed his flashlight into the opening. A ladder descended from the hatch lip into the dark. Its rungs, made from the same steel as the hatch, bolted to the concrete wall of a shaft that dropped perhaps 10 feet before opening into a larger space below. The ladder was intact. The rungs were solid. When Ward tested the top two from above, he looked at Atlas. "Stay," he said. Not a command with any uncertainty in it, a statement of what was going to happen. Atlas settled back into his watching posture, chin on his paws, eyes on Ward. Ward went down the ladder. The shaft was narrow enough that his shoulders nearly touched both walls, and it was deep enough that the light from the barn above was negligible by the time his feet reached the bottom rung. He stepped off the ladder onto a concrete floor and directed his flashlight in a slow arc through the space. The room was small, perhaps 12 feet square, with 8-foot ceilings that were low enough to feel deliberate, designed to minimize the volume of air that needed to be managed and the amount of concrete that needed to be poured. The walls were concrete block laid with a precision that spoke of someone who either had masonry experience or had taken a very long time to learn it in the execution. The floor was poured concrete, sealed with something that had preserved it well against the moisture that concrete floors in underground spaces contended with. Along 3 of the 4 walls were steel shelving units, heavy gauge, the kind designed for industrial use, bolted to the concrete block at intervals that distributed the load. And on those shelves were the boxes. They were steel, each one roughly the size of a suitcase, sealed with latching mechanisms that had been designed for security rather than convenience. There were 9 of them distributed across the shelves in a configuration that suggested they had been placed with thought about weight distribution and access sequence. Each one had a small adhesive label on its face that had aged to near illegibility. The printing faded to a ghost that Ward could only partly read. He stood in the center of the room and looked at them. His flashlight beam moved from box to box, left to right, upper shelf to lower shelf, taking the inventory of the space with the systematic attention he brought to any new environment. His mind was working through what he was seeing without letting the implications of what he was seeing get ahead of the actual observation. That was discipline. That was 15 years of training not to let the interpretation outrun the evidence. He crossed to the nearest box on the left-hand shelf and examined the latch mechanism. A different design from the padlock above, simpler, designed to be opened by the person who had placed its contents inside rather than to resist an outside attempt to breach it. The latch was stiff but not locked. Ward worked it carefully, feeling for the give that would tell him the mechanism was yielding rather than about to fail. The lid opened. Inside, nested in a bed of dense foam that had been custom cut to hold its contents securely against movement over years, were gold coins. Ward had seen gold before. He had seen things of significant value in various contexts and in various parts of the world. And his relationship to the sight of them was professional rather than covetous, the relationship of a man who understood what such things meant without being moved by the sight of them. But he was moved by this. He did not entirely understand why, and he did not spend time analyzing it. He simply stood in the underground room of Edgar Pruitt's farm and looked at the coins in the foam and felt the weight of what he was looking at. The coins were older than he would have expected. Not ancient, not coins from centuries past, but coins from decades past. American gold coins from the early and mid-20th century, the kind that had been taken out of circulation when the country changed its monetary policies, and that had accumulated value over the years in the way that rare things accumulated value when people who understood them took care of them. They were in excellent condition, the preservation of the foam having done its job over however many years they had been in here. He set the lid back on the first box and moved to the second. The second box held documents, thick envelopes, sealed, labeled in the same faded hand he recognized from the journal. And beneath the envelopes, bundled and sealed in airtight plastic sleeves, were government bonds. Old ones from the same mid-century period as the coins, the kind that had been sold to citizens during the war and that had been maturing in value for decades in the cool, sealed dark of this room. The third box held currency, paper money, American bills in large denominations, preserved in the same kind of airtight plastic sleeves as the bonds, still flexible, the colors still distinct, the printing still legible. Ward had done enough research on the property before buying it to understand the general principles of what cash preserved. This way, over this kind of period, could be worth, which was considerably more than its face value, if the preservation was good, because old currency in good condition had value to collectors that went beyond the number printed on it. He opened 4 more boxes, more coins, more bonds, more documents and sealed envelopes. In one box, a smaller collection of objects that took Ward a moment to categorize decorative items, small the kind that belonged to a category of collectibles he was less familiar with, but whose age and quality were apparent even to an untrained eye. He did not open all 9 boxes. After the 7th, he sat down on the concrete floor with his back against the wall and directed his flashlight at the ceiling and thought. He was not a person who made large errors in estimation. His ability to assess situations and their implications quickly and accurately had been a professional asset for 15 years, and it did not fail him now. What he had just looked at across 7 of 9 boxes in this underground room was a collection that had been assembled over decades by someone who understood what he was assembling and had taken extraordinary care of it. The coins alone, if his assessment of their age and condition was correct, represented a significant sum. The bonds, if they were what they appeared to be, represented more the currency, the documents, the other items he had seen. The number that was forming in Ward's mind was a number that he kept revising upward as he added each element to it. He thought about Edgar Pruitt, about 60 years of patient accumulation on this farm, about the journal entries that describe the project without describing it, about the final line to whoever comes after this was always yours. He thought about what it cost to sit on something like this for 60 years, to accumulate it and protect it and never use it and never tell anyone and trust that eventually the right person would find it. He got up and went to the shelving unit at the far end of the room, the one he had left for last, and opened the box on the bottom shelf. This box was different from the others, not in its construction, which was identical to the rest, different in what it contained. There were coins here too at the bottom, fewer than in the first box, but the same quality. But on top of the coins, placed where it would be the first thing seen when the lid was opened, was an envelope, thick sealed with wax that had hardened over the years to a deep amber color, the wax carrying an impression that might have been a thumb pressed into it when it was soft. On the front of the envelope, in Edgar Pruitt's handwriting, now entirely recognizable to Ward from weeks of reading the journal, were these words, "For the person standing in this room." Ward held the envelope and did not open it immediately. He held it the way you held something that you understood was significant, letting the significance settle before you moved further into it. He had learned this from the journal itself, from the way Edgar wrote, from the quality of care that the old man had brought to every decision he had made in building this place and everything inside it. That kind of care deserved a reciprocal care in the receiving. He opened the envelope. The letter inside was several pages, the same deliberate handwriting as the journal, the same quality of precision in the language. Ward stood in the underground room of a $1 farm in rural Tennessee and read what Edgar Pruitt had written for him for whoever he turned out to be. Edgar wrote about the war first, more directly than he had in the journal. He wrote about Normandy in the way that men who had been there sometimes eventually wrote about it, not with the kind of dramatic narrative that kept the events at a distance, but with the specific detail of someone who was there and had never fully left. He wrote about the beach and the men beside him, and what the morning had looked like, and what the noise had been, and what had happened. He did not dwell on it. He moved through it in a few paragraphs, and then moved to what came after. The men who came home, he wrote. That is what this is about. I have never been able to stop thinking about the men who came home. Not the ones who didn't come home, though I have thought about them too every day of my life since 1944. But the ones who came home, because the ones who came home had to figure out how to live, and a lot of them never did figure it out, not fully, and the country didn't help them figure it out. It just needed them to be something other than what the war had made them, and couldn't wait very long for them to get there. I watched Alvin Sears work at that hardware store for 40 years with shaking hands and a drinking problem that nobody talked about, and a government pension that was barely enough to live on. I watched Raymond Haley lose his farm to the bank in 1963 because he couldn't manage the books anymore, couldn't hold the numbers in his head the way he used to be able to. And there was nothing and nobody to help him keep it. I watched men who had been as capable as any men I ever knew become diminished by something they couldn't name and didn't understand and couldn't ask for help with, because asking for help wasn't something men of that time and that place were equipped to do. I decided early on that I was going to do something about it. I didn't know what. I just knew I was going to do something, because doing something was the only thing I knew how to do. What I could do was build. I could work and save and build. I did not have the temperament for politics or charity work or any of the organized things that some men turn to. I had the temperament for the quiet, patient accumulation of a thing over a long time. And so that is what I did. Everything in this room represents 60 years of work. Some of it is the literal product of that work, the wages and the savings of decades. Some of it is what those savings became when I put them into things that grew in value, because I understood what would hold value and what would not. I was not educated in these matters formally. I educated myself because there was something I needed to do, and the education was part of doing it. I am putting this letter here because I know I will not be able to give this to the right person directly. I do not know who the right person is. I only know that whoever has the patience to take this property on, the patience to stay with it when it looks like nothing and everyone tells them it is nothing, is someone who understands something about the long view. And that is the kind of person I want to have this. Use it for what it was built for, he had written. For men who came home and need something to stand on. For anyone who served and came back different and needs a place and a chance and a foundation. That is what I built it for. That is what I want it to do. The final paragraph of the letter was brief. I spent a lot of years alone, it read. That was a choice I made, and I am not asking for anyone to feel sorry about it. But I will tell you honestly that I hope whoever stands in this room is someone who is not alone, not entirely. I hope they have someone with them, someone who found this with them. That would make me glad. Ward folded the letter and put it back in its envelope. He stood in the underground room for a long time. He thought about the men Edgar had written about Alvin Sears with his shaking hands at the hardware store, about Raymond Haley losing his farm in 1963. He thought about them as the specific individuals they had been, not as categories, but as men. Men who had been somewhere and come back and tried to re-enter a life that didn't quite fit anymore, tried to re-enter it without the language to describe what was wrong. and without the help to address it, even if they had the language. He thought about himself, about the apartment in Nashville that wasn't home, about the 2 years since discharge that had had a quality he had difficulty naming even to himself, about the reasons he had come to this particular property in this particular county for this particular price. He thought about Edgar's final hope. I hope they have someone with them, someone who found this with them. He thought about Atlas, who was 10 feet above him at the top of a ladder, lying in the barn doorway waiting. Ward climbed back up the ladder. He emerged from the hatch into the late afternoon light of the barn, the light falling through the gaps in the barn's walls in long horizontal shafts full of dust, and Atlas was exactly where he had been when Ward went down, chin on his paw's eyes on the hatch, waiting with the particular patience of a dog that had learned that waiting was sometimes the work. Atlas got up when Ward came through the hatch. He did not bark or rush. He simply stood and looked at Ward and waited to understand what came next. Ward sat on the barn floor beside the open hatch and put his hand on the dog's head. He needed to report this. He was clear about that. Whatever the legal dimensions of what he had found, whatever the questions about ownership and obligation and process that a discovery like this generated, he was not going to try to navigate around those questions or ahead of them or outside of them. He was going to walk straight into them because that was how he had learned to deal with things that needed dealing with. He drove into town the next morning and asked at the hardware store for the sheriff's office. And Grover told him where it was, and Ward drove there and went inside. Sheriff Dale McCraw was a man in his late 50s with the physical bearing of someone who had spent decades in a job that required presence, not the performed presence of someone trying to project authority, but the settled presence of someone who simply occupied whatever space he was in without effort. He had the manner of a man who had heard a great many things in his working life and had developed the capacity to hear them without immediate reaction. Ward told him what he had found. Not everything, not in the detail he might have told it to someone else, but the essential facts, the hatch, the room, the boxes, and what they contained, the letter. McCraw listened without interrupting. When Ward finished, the sheriff was quiet for a moment. You said there's a letter, he said. From the previous owner. Yes. Stating his intent for the property. Yes. And you have that letter. I have it. McCraw nodded slowly. He looked at the surface of his desk. You understand that a find like this creates questions about ownership and legal obligation that I'm not in a position to answer for you. I understand that, Ward said. That's why I'm here. I wanted someone official to know what I found before I did anything else with it. McCraw looked at him for a moment. You could have just not told anyone, he said. Not as a suggestion, as an observation. I could have, Ward said. McCraw nodded again. He picked up a pen and set it back down. What do you want to do, he said. I want to know what I'm legally required to do, Ward said. And then I want to do exactly that. McCraw told him what he knew, which was enough to give Ward direction and not enough to give him answers. Tennessee law on buried property and abandoned estates was not a simple set of rules. It involved questions of intent and documentation, and the chain of legal ownership, and the distinction between property that was abandoned and property that was specifically designated. Ward would need a lawyer. He would need the letter Edgar had left. He would need the deed of sale and the documentation of how the property had come to be listed and sold and under what circumstances. Ward thanked him and drove back to the farm. He called a lawyer that afternoon, a woman who practiced in property law in the county seat, and described the situation in sufficient detail for her to tell him that she could help him and that it was going to take time and that the most important thing he had in his favor was the letter. The letter changes the character of what you found, she said. If Edgar Pruitt demonstrably intended for whoever owned the property to have what was underneath it. That's a different legal situation than buried property with no stated intent. It's not a simple situation, but it's a better one than the alternative. Ward thanked her and set up an appointment. He was doing dishes that evening, Atlas eating beside him, when his phone showed a notification from a news alert service that he had set up years ago for various reasons and had never gotten around to canceling. The alert was for a search he had set up on the property's address, a habit from due diligence before the purchase. The notification was for a local news item, a brief piece on the county news website, 4 paragraphs, reporting that a former property belonging to the late Edgar Pruitt of rural Tennessee had been purchased by a private buyer and that the new owner had reportedly made a significant discovery on the property and had contacted the county sheriff's office. Ward read it twice. The piece was short on specifics, long on vagueness, the kind of reporting produced when someone had a partial story and was filling the gaps with implication. It did not say what had been found. It said significant discovery and let the reader's imagination do the rest. He set his phone on the counter and finished the dishes. 4 days later, his lawyer called. There is a claimant, she said. Her name is Sylvia Pruitt. She says she is Edgar Pruitt's grandniece. She has a lawyer and she is arguing that as the only known living relative of Edgar Pruitt, she has a superior claim to any property or assets associated with his estate. Ward was quiet for a moment. Does she? He said. She has a claim, his lawyer said carefully. Whether it's superior is going to be the question. When did Edgar Pruitt last have contact with this woman? Ward thought about the journal. About 50 years of entries that described a life of specific solitude, of deliberate distance from a world that had not adequately cared for the people he cared about. He thought about the entries that described going to town for supplies and coming back and working, and never, not once, in the years of entries he had read describing a visitor. As far as I can tell from his journals, Ward said he had no contact with anyone he was related to for the entirety of his time on this property. 60 years, his lawyer said. She was quiet for a moment. Did he leave a will? Not a formal one, Ward said. But he left a letter. Tell me about the letter. Ward told her. After he finished, she was quiet for a longer moment. The letter is your best asset right now, she said. The specificity of it, the fact that he wrote it to whoever owns the property, makes it clear that he was thinking about this when he wrote it, and that his intent was tied to ownership rather than blood relation. It's not a simple argument, and Sylvia Pruitt's lawyer is going to make the other argument as loudly as possible. But it's a defensible position. What do you need from me, Ward said. Everything, she said. Every document, the journal, the letter, the deed, the listing, documentation from the county, anything that establishes the chain of what happened to this property from Edgar Pruitt's death to your purchase of it. And she paused. Whatever else you can find out about Edgar Pruitt that establishes who he was and what he intended. Ward said he would get her what she needed and ended the call. He sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse that he had spent 6 weeks making functional and looked at the journal on the shelf where he kept it. Everything he could find out about Edgar Pruitt. He had the journal, he had the letter, he had the boxes in the room below the barn, and in the boxes he had the envelopes of documents that he had not yet fully examined. He had spent 6 weeks reading the journal in pieces and had not yet read every entry in it. He picked up the journal and began to read from the beginning this time, with the specific purpose of understanding everything he could understand about the man who had written it. He read for most of the night. What he found in the journal across the full arc of it was the record of a life that was more specific and more complex than the practical entries had initially suggested. Edgar Pruitt had not been merely a quiet man who accumulated things in secret. He had been a man with a particular history and a particular set of experiences that had shaped everything he subsequently did, and the journal read in full and in sequence made that history visible. The entries about the war were sparse, but the war was present in every subsequent entry in the way that formative experiences were present as a lens through which everything else was seen. Edgar had come home from Normandy with something he never named, but that was visible in the things he wrote about afterward, in the way he responded to the men he saw struggling, in the quality of attention he paid to what was happening to the people around him who had served. He was not a man who had talked about his own experience of the war. He was a man who had carried it and channeled what it had given him into something that mattered to him. What mattered to him was the men. It was in every entry that touched on the subject, the specific focused attention of a man who had decided that the failure he had witnessed, the failure of the country to adequately support the people who served it, was something he was going to address in the only way he knew how to address things, which was quietly and over a long time and without anyone's help or acknowledgement. Ward read the last entry of the journal again, the one dated October 3rd, 2009, the one with the final line set apart from the paragraph above it. To whoever comes after this was always yours. I just kept it until you arrived. He thought about what his lawyer needed. She needed everything he could find about Edgar Pruitt that established who he was and what he intended. He thought about the boxes in the room below the barn and the sealed envelopes in the second box that he had not yet fully examined. He got his flashlight and went to the barn. The envelopes in the second box were the key. Ward had opened them one by one at the kitchen table with Atlas sleeping under his chair, working through the early hours of the morning with the methodical care that the documents deserved and that his training had made second nature. Some envelopes contained financial records, the meticulous bookkeeping of a man who had tracked every purchase and every transaction across decades with the same precision he applied to everything else. Some contained certificates of various kinds, the documentation of the bonds and the coins, and the other items in the boxes below. But 3 of the envelopes contained something different. They contained letters, not letters from Edgar, letters to Edgar from people whose names Ward did not recognize, written at different points across the decades. He read them in the order they had been filed. The first was from a man named Thomas Vickers, written in 1967. Thomas Vickers had been one of Edgar's fellow soldiers, a man who had survived Normandy and then Korea and had come home the second time to circumstances that were by his account untenable. The letter described those circumstances without self-pity, in the matter-of-fact language of a man who was simply reporting what was true. He had lost his job, he had lost his house, his wife had left him with the children because she could not manage what he had become after 2 wars, and she had needed to protect the children from it. He had written to Edgar because Edgar was the only person from those years he knew how to find, and he needed to tell someone who would understand. At the bottom of the letter in different ink and in Edgar's handwriting was a note, sent him $300, asked him to use it for an apartment deposit in the first month. He did. Letter received 6 months later. He is stable. The second letter was from 1979. A different name, a different set of circumstances, but recognizable in its essential shape, a man who had served, who had come home changed, who had run out of resources and options, and had found Edgar's address somewhere and written to him as a last resort. The note at the bottom of this letter in Edgar's hand sent 200. Called the VA office in his county and stayed on the phone until someone actually committed to visiting him. The third letter was from 1991, another name, another situation that was different in its specific details and identical in its essential nature. Ward sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse with these 3 letters in front of him and thought about what they told him. Edgar had not only been building the room below the barn, he had been doing this all along using what he had to help the men he saw struggling quietly, without organization or recognition, one man at a time when he could find them. The room below the barn was the larger version of what he had already been doing on a smaller scale for decades. It was the culmination of a practice, not the beginning of one. Ward photographed each letter carefully with his phone. He photographed every document in every envelope. He photographed the financial records with their decades of meticulous entries. He photographed the journal from cover to cover, every page, every entry, the complete record of Edgar Pruitt's life on this property and the purpose he had given it. He sent everything to his lawyer before dawn. Her response came mid-morning. This changes things significantly. Call me, he called her. Ward, she said before he could speak. I need you to understand what we have here. This isn't just a letter stating intent. What you've sent me is a 50-year documented record of a man systematically using his personal resources to support veterans in need. The journal, the letters, the financial records, all of it together tells a very coherent story about who Edgar Pruitt was and what everything on that property was for. A court is going to be able to see that story clearly. What does that mean for the case, Ward said. It means Sylvia Pruitt's argument just got harder, she said. A grandniece who had no contact with Edgar Pruitt for the entirety of his adult life is trying to claim assets that he spent 60 years specifically building for someone in your circumstances. The documentation you've given me makes his intent explicit and his history consistent with that intent across decades. Ward was quiet for a moment. She is family, though, he said. Whatever the circumstances. Yes, his lawyer said. She is, and a court will weigh that. But family who was absent for 60 years is different from family who was present. And Edgar's own documentation suggests the absence was mutual and deliberate. He didn't reach out to her. She didn't reach out to him. Whatever the reason for that, it's going to be relevant. Ward stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the barn. How long is this going to take? He said. Several months, she said, at minimum. These things move at the pace courts move, which is not fast. What I want you to do is continue living on the property and continuing to improve it. The documentation of your ongoing stewardship is also relevant to how a court will view your claim. He said he understood and ended the call. He went out to the barn and did a full hour of structural assessment on the north wall. The wall that had been worrying him the most, making notes on what it needed and in what order. Then he came back inside and made a list of the work that remained on the property and organized it by priority and went to the hardware store for materials. Grover looked at him across the counter when he came in. Heard there's been some trouble, Grover said. With the property, some Ward said. Grover nodded. He began adding up the materials on the list Ward had given him. You know, he said, without looking up, Edgar Pruitt was in here once or twice a year for the entire time I can remember. He never talked much. But he always paid on time, and he always knew exactly what he needed, and he never wasted anyone's time. He paused. Whatever that woman is claiming, he said carefully, Edgar was not the kind of man who forgot about people. He finished the total and told Ward what it came to. Ward paid and loaded the materials. The months that followed had the quality of a thing suspended in its own process. The legal matter moved forward in the way legal matters moved, which was steadily and invisibly until it suddenly became visible again in the form of a court date or a filing or a piece of correspondence that required attention. Ward went to meetings with his lawyer. He submitted documents. He answered questions in written form that were submitted to the other side. Sylvia Pruitt's lawyer made arguments in filings that Ward read carefully and thought about and discussed with his own lawyer and contributed what he could to addressing. He did not stop working on the farm. This was partly the instruction from his lawyer, who had told him that his stewardship of the property was relevant, but it was more than that. The work was what the days needed. Without it, the days had a quality that he recognized as the old quality, the quality of the apartment in Nashville, the quality of the 2 years after discharge, when the days had been too full of nothing and the nights had been too full of something else. The farm gave the days a structure that his mind and his body required, and he was not inclined to give that up even temporarily for any reason. The barn north wall was repaired by the end of October. The roof of the farmhouse, which he had addressed on arrival, was properly insulated by mid-November. He repaired the fencing that had collapsed entirely in the east portion of the property and reset the posts on the sections that were still standing but compromised. He cleared the north field completely of the 12 years of brush growth that had claimed it and turned the soil in preparation for spring. Atlas was with him for all of it. The dog had settled into the farm with the naturalness of an animal that had been searching for a specific configuration of space and purpose without knowing it was searching, and had found it. He ran the fields every morning in the wide-ranging pattern of a dog, using its full physical capacity for the first time in years, returning periodically to wherever Ward was working to check in, and then ranging out again. In the evenings, he slept on the porch, and in the nights he slept on the floor beside Ward's bed, and the quality of the nights on the farm was different from the quality of the nights in Nashville, in a way that Ward did not analyze, but was grateful for. He found the rest of what Edgar had left in November, not in the room below the barn. In the barn itself, in a space behind a false panel in the east wall that Atlas found on a rainy afternoon when Ward was working inside the barn and the dog began investigating the wall with the specific focused attention that Ward had learned to read as indication. The panel came away when Ward pressed it in the right place, and behind it was a narrow recess that held a single object, a metal document case, the kind used for important papers, sealed and locked with a combination mechanism. Ward found the combination in the journal. Edgar had not been obvious about it, had not labeled it or indicated it directly, but he had mentioned a specific date in a specific entry in a way that felt deliberate, a date that did not correspond to anything else in the narrative that appeared in the middle of a passage about a different subject, with a quality that felt placed rather than arrived at naturally. Ward tried the date as a combination in 2 different formats before the third format opened the case. Inside was a single document. It was typed, not handwritten on a typewriter, that had produced the slightly uneven impression characteristic of manual machines of a certain age. It was dated 2010, the same year Edgar had mentioned in the journal as the year he had put his affairs in what order he could put them. It was 2 pages long, and its language was careful and specific in the way of someone who had thought very hard about every word. Ward read it standing in the barn in the November rain. The document was Edgar Pruitt's formal statement of intent regarding the property and everything beneath it. It was not a will in the legal sense, not drafted by an attorney or witnessed by a notary, but it was something. It was a written declaration by a man of sound mind, signed and dated, stating clearly and without ambiguity that the contents of the underground storage facility on his property at the address specified were intended for the person who legally owned that property after his death, and that this intent was absolute and not conditional on the blood relationship of that person to himself. I have no family that I have maintained relationship with the document stated in one passage, and I have not maintained such relationships by choice, as my life and my purpose on this property required a degree of solitude and focus that was not compatible with the obligations of family connection. Any claim made on the basis of blood relation to me should be understood in this context. My deliberate and sustained absence of family relationship over 60 years was not an oversight or a failure. It was a decision. The assets I have accumulated are not a bequest to someone I have not seen and who has not known me. They are a foundation for someone who is living the life I prepared this place for. He had signed it, Edgar James Pruitt. Beneath his signature was the date. Ward photographed the document with his phone. He photographed it twice from different angles to ensure the text was fully legible in both images. He sent both photographs to his lawyer before he left the barn. Her response came in 20 minutes. This is significant. This is very significant. Call me as soon as you can." He called her from the farmhouse porch with Atlas sitting beside him and the rain coming down on the repaired roof of the barn across the yard. "The document itself is not a will," she said immediately, "and we're not going to pretend it is. But it is a contemporaneous written statement of intent by the property owner, signed and dated, that specifically addresses the question of blood relation versus ownership. Combined with the journal and the letters and the financial records, what we have is an extraordinarily complete picture of a man's decades-long intention that is going to be very difficult to argue against. "What's her case at this point?" Ward said. "Blood relation," she said. That's all she has. She's going to argue that blood relation should supersede a document that wasn't legally executed. The counter-argument is that the document, while not formally executed, is consistent with 60 years of documented behavior and stated intent, and that the specific language addressing the blood relation question suggests Edgar Pruitt anticipated exactly this kind of claim and chose to address it directly. Ward looked at the barn. "Will it be enough?" he said. "I think so," she said. "I think it's going to be enough. But I want you to understand something. The hearing is going to look at who Edgar Pruitt was. And who Edgar Pruitt was is going to be established by what you've given me. So I need to make sure we present it completely." He said he understood. The hearing came in February. Ward drove to the county courthouse in the county seat on a gray morning Atlas in the back seat, because leaving him behind at the farm had stopped being something Ward did without reason. His lawyer had told him that the hearing would likely take several hours and that he should expect Sylvia Pruitt's lawyer to be aggressive in presenting her claim, and that he should let his own lawyer handle the presentation without trying to supplement it himself. He had told her he understood that too. Sylvia Pruitt was in the courtroom when Ward arrived. She was in her early 70s, a small woman with silver hair and the particular contained quality of someone who was working to project a confidence she was not certain she had. She was with her lawyer, a man in his 50s who had the manner of someone accustomed to making arguments in rooms like this one. She did not look at Ward when he came in. Ward's lawyer had told him what to expect, and it proceeded as she had described. Sylvia's lawyer argued that blood relation created a legal claim that superseded any informal expression of intent by the deceased. He argued that Edgar Pruitt's failure to formally execute a will left his estate open to the claims of his nearest living relative. He argued that Ward Callum's purchase of the property for $1 did not constitute the kind of legally significant ownership that could override the rights of blood relation. He was making the best argument available to him with the materials he had, which was what lawyers did. Ward's lawyer presented the counter. She did it methodically and without theatrics, beginning with the deed and the circumstances of the property's listing and sale establishing the legal chain of ownership. She presented the journal, the letter from the underground room, the financial records, the 3 letters from veterans Edgar had helped the typed document from the hidden case. She presented each element in sequence, building the picture that the elements together made. She presented the part of Edgar's typed document that addressed the blood relation question and read it aloud in the courtroom. She concluded with something that Ward had not expected. She had, without telling him in advance, obtained Edgar Pruitt's military service record from the National Archives. It was in the record that Edgar Pruitt had survived. Normandy had served through France and into Germany, had been wounded in action in November 1944 and had been evacuated and had recovered and had returned to duty. It was also in the record, in a section that Ward had not known existed, that Edgar Pruitt had been nominated for the Silver Star for actions in Normandy in June 1944, in which he had, under fire and at significant personal risk, pulled 3 wounded soldiers from an exposed position and carried them to covered ground. He had declined the commendation. The record contained a brief statement he had made at the time: "I don't want the medal. I want the men to get the support they need when they get home." The courtroom was quiet when his lawyer finished reading that. The judge asked several questions. She asked Ward's lawyer questions about the legal standing of the typed document. She asked Sylvia Pruitt's lawyer questions about the nature and extent of the family relationship between his client and Edgar Pruitt. She asked specifically when Sylvia Pruitt had last had contact with Edgar Pruitt. The answer delivered by Sylvia's lawyer in careful language that tried to present the fact as neutrally as possible was that there had been no direct contact in over 50 years. The judge was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to take this under advisement," she said. "I'll have a decision within 30 days." Ward drove back to the farm. He worked the next 30 days the way he had worked every day since arriving on the property, moving through the list of what needed to be done with the patient attention of someone who understood that the work was the point regardless of what else was happening. He planted the north field in late February, a cover crop to rebuild the soil. He rebuilt the east section of the barn wall that had been structurally compromised. He ordered the lumber for the addition he was planning on the east side of the farmhouse, a structure that he had been designing in his head for months, a bunkhouse style addition that would be able to accommodate several additional people. He had not talked to anyone about what he intended to do with the property if the court found in his favor. He had not talked about it because it was not the kind of thing he talked about before it was real, before the foundation was solid enough to support what he was going to put on it. But he had been thinking about it since the night he read Edgar's letter in the underground room, since the specific line used it for what it was built for men who came home and need something to stand on. He had been thinking about what standing on something looked like, about what the farm could offer someone who needed it, about the specific things the farm had given him in the months since he had arrived at it with a duffel bag and a dog, and $1 invested and everything else uncertain. The work first, the specific, clear daily work of a place that needed tending, work that used the body and the mind in the right proportions and left enough space for the rest of things to settle rather than accumulate. The space, the physical space of 11 acres in the Tennessee hills with the tree line to the west and the north field and the barn and the farmhouse, and the specific quality of silence at night that was not empty but inhabited by the sounds of the land doing what land did. The rhythm of it, the particular rhythm of agricultural work which moved with the seasons and the light and the requirements of the things being tended and created a structure for the days that was not imposed but emerged from the nature of the work itself. These were things he had needed and had found here. The decision came on the 28th day. His lawyer called him at 7 in the morning. "Ward," she said without preamble, "the court has found in your favor." He was standing in the kitchen with his coffee and the morning light coming through the east window, and Atlas sitting beside him waiting for his breakfast. He said, "Tell me." "The judge's decision is 40 pages, she said. "I'm going to give you the short version now, and we can go through the full document later." She held that the combination of the written statement of intent, the documented history of Edgar Pruitt's behavior, consistent with that intent, and the specific language addressing blood relation created a clear preponderance of evidence for Edgar Pruitt's intention regarding the disposition of the assets. She held that the absence of a formally executed will in combination with the other documentation did not invalidate that intent. And she held that Sylvia Pruitt's claim, based solely on blood relation, without any accompanying evidence of relationship with the deceased, was insufficient to override the documented intent of the property owner. Ward set his coffee down. "She's going to appeal," he said. She might, his lawyer said. "But the ground for appeal is narrow given the evidentiary record. I think she'll be advised not to. We'll wait and see." When he ended the call, he stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he put on his jacket and went out to the barn and opened the hatch and went down the ladder for the third time. He stood in the underground room with the steel shelves and the steel boxes and the flashlight, and he thought about Edgar Pruitt, who had spent 60 years building this in secret for someone he did not know. He thought about Alvin Sears with his shaking hands at the hardware store. He thought about the letter from 1967 and the note Edgar had written at the bottom of it, and the one from 1979 and the one from 1991. He thought about a 22-year-old who had come home from Normandy in the autumn of 1945 with something he never named and had channeled it, all of it, every year of the rest of his life into something that was meant to be useful after he was gone. He climbed back up the ladder. He drove into town that afternoon and met with a lawyer who handled estate and nonprofit law, a different lawyer from his property lawyer, and began the conversation about what the right legal structure would look like for what he intended to do. They talked for 2 hours. The structure that emerged from the conversation was not complicated, but it needed to be done correctly. And doing it correctly would take time and would require the proper documentation and the proper filing. He went to the hardware store on his way back and told Grover that the court had found in his favor. Grover looked at him for a moment. "Good," he said. "That's right." Ward drove back to the farm. The spring came to the Tennessee Hill Country in the particular way it came there, not all at once, but in stages. The first warmth followed by a late cold, and then a real warmth that held and deepened the north field he had planted in February, coming up green across the full 11 acres, the kitchen garden producing its first growth in the beds he had established on the south side of the house. The barn stood straight or straighter, the structural work of the winter having addressed the worst of its lean, and the farmhouse was what a farmhouse was supposed to be, a place that worked, that held what it was supposed to hold, and kept out what it was supposed to keep out. The bunkhouse addition was framed and roofed by April. Ward did much of the work himself and hired out the parts that required expertise he did not have and could not efficiently acquire. He was not in a hurry. The work was the right work, and he gave it the time it needed. He named the property Pruitt Farm, not because it had been named that before it had not been named anything that he knew of. It had just been the Pruitt place in the way that rural properties were referred to by the name of whoever had last lived there, but because the name needed to carry the right history, and the right history was Edgar's. The first veteran arrived in June. His name was Marcus Webb, 29 years old, a Marine who had been in the hospital system for 18 months following his second deployment, and who had been recommended to Ward by a contact Ward had made through the process of establishing the program. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in a truck that had more miles on it than it probably should have, and he stood in the driveway and looked at the farm with the specific quality of attention of a person who was trying to assess a situation before they committed to it. Ward came off the porch with Atlas beside him. Marcus Webb looked at the dog. "He trained with you," he said. "Yes," Ward said. Marcus looked back at the farmhouse and the barn and the north field and the bunkhouse addition to the east. "What do I do here?" he said. Ward looked at the farm, at the north field that had needed clearing and planting and tending, at the barn that had needed rebuilding, at the fencing that still needed attention in the south section, at the kitchen garden that needed weeding and watering, and the work of hands that knew they had a purpose. "Whatever needs doing," Ward said. Marcus nodded slowly, and then he walked toward the barn to see what needed doing. Atlas sat beside Ward on the porch, and they watched him go. The morning light was the good morning light of early summer in the Tennessee hills, long and clean and full of the specific quality of a day that was starting rather than ending. Ward thought about the room below the barn floor, about what was in it and what it was going to become. He thought about Edgar Pruitt, who had spent 60 years building a foundation for people he would never meet, who had declined a medal in 1944 because he wanted the men to get the support they needed, who had written in his journal for 60 years without ever losing sight of the thing he was building and the reason he was building it. He thought about Atlas finding the hatch in the floor on a cold autumn afternoon, the precise and patient nose of a trained dog reading what was under the surface of things. He thought about everything that had followed from that moment: the letter, the room, the documents, the hearing, the decision. Marcus Webb walking toward the barn right now to find out what needed doing. He thought about what Edgar had written in the final line of his statement: the assets I have accumulated are a foundation for someone who is living the life I prepared this place for. He was living it. He was building what Edgar had built this place for him to build. And Atlas, who had found the hatch and started everything that followed, was sitting beside him on the porch in the morning light in the way that Atlas always sat beside him, present, without demand, steady, without effort, the specific and irreplaceable presence of an animal that had found its person and its place and had no intention of being anywhere else. Ward put his hand on the dog's head. The north field was green and the bunkhouse was full of light and the barn stood straight, and Marcus Webb had disappeared inside it, beginning the work of his first day on a farm that had been waiting for exactly the people who were now beginning to arrive. Ward looked out at all of it. This was what Edgar had built it for. This was what it had always been for.